It's a great pleasure to have Emanuele Zappalà with us. As already Giuseppe mentioned, Emanuele's career starts in Catania, where Emanuele got a bachelor in physics, and then he moved on to the King College in London, where he got a graduate diploma in mathematics, and then at the University of Glasgow, where he got a master, completed a master in mathematics, and then he started a PhD in South Florida, the University of South Florida in Tampa. And he moved on quite regularly, I would say. He was a research fellow at the University of Michigan, and presently he's an associate research scientist at Yale, working together with Professor David Van Dyck. What is quite interesting in Emanuele's research is this interesting and, at least to me, almost obscure links between advanced mathematics and brain functions, which is something quite new. Is a completely and very exciting new field. So when I heard about what Emanuele was doing myself, I found quite exciting to invite him try to invite him for a talk to the students in the school here in Catania, which I would say Emanuele was accepted quite enthusiastically. So I would say that currently Emanuele is interested. Emanuele, you will correct me if I am wrong, but he's interested in deep learning as a tool to model brain dynamics. And in one of his last papers, he applied this model in calcium imaging data, mainly from coming from mice performing a visual task. But actually, the tool, the technique, can tell us quite a lot, and this is what Emanuele will tell us today. How is possible using this technique to understand some spatiotemporal patterns in neural activity in the brain? So I hope I gave a good picture. So Emanuele, now the stage is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. So you see my screen, right? Learning brain dynamics for integral equation. So thank you very much to Professors Angelella and Leanza for organizing this talk. And the picture is pretty accurate, roughly, I would say. And my interest, yes, comes at the intersection between machine learning and mathematical tools in machine learning, from topology, dynamical systems, integral equations, and applied applications of this machine learning to brain dynamics and also fluidodynamics, as I will mention later on. So what does learning brain dynamics mean here? It means that we want a machine learning method, so a deep learning. Here, deep learning means artificial intelligence, a model that sees data, learns patterns, and gives you back something. And integral equation models will be basically machine learning methods based on integral equations, which I will introduce. I will also describe something about integral equations in general. You saw the slide changing, right?
Yeah, everything is okay.
Okay. Perfect. So, I wanted to thank Giampiero Leanza and Giuseppe Angelella, but also thanks to my co-authors of these two studies. And here, the best thing of this slide is that, of this list of co-authors, is that we all do different stuff. So I do applied mathematics. Antonio Fonseca and Josue Caro, they do computational neuroscience. Andrew Moberly and Michael Higley, they are neuroscientists. Shadi Abdallah and Jessica Carding, they do different types of data set in neurology. David Van Dyke is a computer scientist. It's a very varied team with different interests, and we all came together to work on something that is a scope for all of us. So this work generated in the Van Dyke lab, which is a laboratory at Yale University between the Yale School of Medicine and the Department of Computer Science. And I'll give an outline of the presentation, but you can always interrupt me during the presentation. I don't mind. You don't need to wait until the end of the talk. So I will give a brief motivation on brain dynamics and brain recordings. So as an applied mathematician, I'm not the best one for this scope, unfortunately, out of the many collaborators. But the main interest here is, the main takeout is that neuroscience produces big data. And it produces a lot of data recordings and videos of the brain, and we don't know exactly what to do. So that's the whole point of when machine learning comes into mind. So into play, artificial intelligence wants to make something out of these huge data sets. I will also mention some basic facts on integral and integral differential equations. In fact, these are two different models based, one on integral equations and one on integral differential equations. So I will just mention things from both without getting lost into the details of the differences between the two. I will mention how you solve these equations and how to use these equations to construct some deep learning models. So what these deep learning models do, and how you do training on these objects. And I will show some experiments on fluid dynamics and especially brain dynamics at the end, which is the main interest and final scope. And I will also finally mention few future perspective on projects we are working on related to this stuff, and what you can do at a mathematical level also as an applied mathematician who has trained an integral operator, and you want to do something and understand something relative to the brain. When we talk about brain activity, of course, we are discussing an oversimplification maybe of one of the most fascinating and most complex objects that is known to humankind. The brain consists of billions of neurons and trillions of connections, which is, it's already, if you think about this, it really makes you feel like you have already lost the battle even before starting. But we can do accurate models nonetheless, or at least this is the hope. The main thing here is that you can there are several techniques that produce images of the brain and videos of the brain, right? And they are increasingly accurate. They're very new techniques, and they produce very high quality images with very detailed activation of neurons, so they show very well the functionality of the brain. But the thing is that if I am able to model the brain, so if you give me, for instance, a video of 10 frames of the brain and the activity of this brain, so neurons turning on and neurons turning off, right? And I can predict 5 more frames, let's say. So I have a reasonable method that tells me what the dynamics looks like. Does it mean I know the brain? Does it mean I can connect anything like this to function? So does it mean that if you give me a video, I can tell you what that person or mouse or whatever was doing when the recording was, when the video was recorded? This is not necessarily the case. So this is the great obstacle. So it turns out the funny thing is that the obstacle, it's even earlier than that, because when I first was introduced to the problem, I was interested, and my main concern was, of course, okay, let's say we have a good machine learning method that predicts dynamics. Let's say, what do we do with that about function? It turns out that the issue is even a little bit earlier than that. There are no good methods at all. Actually, all the known methods fail to a spectacular degree. So to some extent, even the methods I will present that do much better than other methods in several tasks, they fail in several others. So the problem is much more complex than one might expect from the beginning. And the main issue is that the brain works in different scales that refer both to space and time. So the brain has several levels at which it works with respect to time. While we think, we have memories, we predict the future, we expect the future, we have all sort of dynamics that go on that can generate from the past, from previous activation. So, and we also have connections in the brain that are not just relating to contiguous places. So we have connections, even though they're not extremely likely, but we have long distance connections in the brain that create sort of propagation of signals with skips, very long jumps, right? So the corresponding dynamics is very complex, and this is why we ended up using integral equations and integral differential equations. So brain activity here means fMRI. So this is an image of fMRI that shows the activity of the brain using basically the blood flow. So you have images of this sort where you see activations and deactivation here and there in the brain. And this is what I will mean by dynamical system or dynamics. These changes over time of these activations and these intensity of the pixels of the signals. Another type of brain activity and data that I will consider is this calcium imaging, which is a very new technique that uses calcium concentration as a proxy for neural activity, because it represents electrical activity in the brain. So here the data is the actual data that was produced at Yale University in the Carden lab, and these are So these are one traditional ordinary differential equation model and our neural integral differential equation model predictions. So this is what I will mean by dynamical system and dynamics. So what about integral equations and why integral equations especially? So why we want a machine learning algorithm based on this to tackle this problem? So integral equations, they appear in several systems throughout the sciences. They are very common in physics, but they are also very common in biology in several systems, like for instance the brain, which was the initial motivation for us, but also they appear very commonly also in engineering, and they are much more common than one would expect. Some specific examples include the Amari model and the Wilson-Cowan model. So they deal with brain dynamics. They are integral differential equations, but they can be recast also as integral equations. And Volterra's models on population dynamics. This is the prehistory of integral equations. But also in particle physics, they appear in the equations for particle accelerators, in nuclear physics, in the reactors. they're very useful to describe the dynamics, and they also find applications in Boltzmann and Landau kinetic equations in plasma physics. So biology is non-local in several systems. For instance, the brain presents high non-locality in spatial non-localities due to disconnections between far neurons. So you can have this connection, even though, like, for instance, here you see the distribution of the probability. They become decreasingly likely in an exponential fashion with the distance. Still, the far connections are not probability zero. Actually, there are some of these ones, and they have an effect that is significant on the dynamics. But also in other simpler systems, like in tissue biology, cells can interact in not only with their neighbors, but also by sending signals with far cells. So all these things are very difficult to model because it means that your dynamics is non-local, which is one of the main features of integral equations and integral differential equations, and therefore is one of the main motivations for us to go into this direction. So I mentioned integral equations now often enough for to deserve the answer to the question, what is an integral equation, to start with. Well, I mean, as the name suggests, integral equations are equations where an integral appears. And by this is meant that you want to solve this equation for a function, so they're not equations over a variable. You want to understand the whole function. In this case, function means a mapping of for instance, time and space to a signal, for instance. So the brain dynamics with respect to time can be seen as a function here. So you want to at the pixel intensity, for instance, for each time point and for each point in space, space being here the brain. So, and you want to solve this equation, so to find these brain dynamics. If you have also space coordinates, so this is only time, and if you have space coordinates, you also have an integral over the domain, which omega here would be the geometric position of the brain, right? So if you were interested in an integral differential equations that I've also mentioned, this would be a derivative with respect to time, for instance, derivative with respect to time, or even you can add partial derivative with respect to space here. And of course, the more things you add, the more complex these equations become and more problematic. And so how, as I have mentioned, so as you might have suspected, the main interest of integral equations and also integral differential equations, so I will kind of refer to these as IDs with D in parentheses for integral equations and D for differential, if there is any differential part. And the main thing is that they are non-local. So exactly how this problem in biology of non-locality appears, these type of equations give an answer to what non-local dynamical systems can, to how non-local dynamical systems can be modeled. They therefore are good for processes where there is a long distance type of relation with respect to space and with respect to time. So for instance, time delays are typical examples. And as such, they generalize several types of differential equations, including ODEs, PDEs, so partial differential equations, ordinary differential equations, delayed differential equations. So this is diagrammatically shown in this way. If you have a local time, so you can infer the relationship of your system by just looking at temporal neighbors. You have an ordinary differential equation. If you can do the same but with respect to space, you have a PDE, the partial differential equation. So whenever you are interested in this pixel here in the center with blue, you have to look at the neighbors, and that will be enough for you to understand what the value of this should be. So you can solve these equations by just moving, step by step and looking at different points as you increase basically what you're solving, right? However, when you have integral equations, and also this would hold for integral differential equations, here to know the value of this blue pixel here, you have to look at the whole space. And effectively, you should do this also for all frames in time. So if this is the brain, this is a sort of regular grid representing the brain in a very, very rough way. It's reasonable to say that if I want to know the value of one neuron, I should know all the values of all the other neurons in all the times, which of course makes it much more complicated, but is the only way you can be accurate in your predictions and your model can tell you something. This brings to the question of how you solve this thing. So this might be, I'll keep the technicalities to the minimum, but I just want to emphasize that here the main issue is that these knowing all the values for all points creates a lot of problems, because when you want to solve for one temporal point or for one spatial point, you should integrate over the whole space-time domain. And this is, of course, difficult because you want to find your values to start with. So how can I integrate something everywhere if I don't even know the thing in one point? So, of course, this is a terrible issue. But there are very strong methods to do this thing, and the solution is actually surprisingly simple. It's based on the von Neumann series to find the inverse of operators, or more generally, if the operator is nonlinear, you can do the Picard successive approximation method, which is surprisingly simple for the type of problem that you start with. So slightly more detail, what you do is you discard the integral equation at the beginning and you initialize your equation only with the thing that you know, which is the f function that I showed before. Then you apply the integral operator to this function and sum to whatever you had before, and then you keep going. You apply the operator again to the new solution and then sum to the previous one and keep going. So what these produces is a series of functions that, if it converges, will converge to the solution. Of course, might be ill-behaved and you might not end up with a solution, but these are very sort of pathological cases. So now, of course, there is there's the elephant in the room to be discussed. So yeah, so far I've mentioned to solve an integral equation or an integral differential equation, but what if I don't even have the integral equation to start with? So what if because after all, computational neuroscience has recordings as its main input. So neuroscientists produce recordings of brain doing activities, right? So someone produces, does some activity, and this corresponds to neuronal activity. The mouse is running over the wheel, and this corresponds to some dynamics of the brain. But where is my integral equation? Where is my integral differential equation? What can I solve if I don't even have the integral equation to start with? And this is where machine learning comes into play. So our model wanted to produce an integral equation and an integral differential equation from neural recordings. So what we do, we have this machine learning method takes a data set that you provide with a lot of recordings of the brain, and it learns from that the integral operator of the corresponding integral equation or integral differential equation. So this is why the name of the talk was learning brain dynamics. So you learn the dynamics in the sense that you learn the equation corresponding to the dynamics. And as such, this is an operator learning task. So you're not learning something that fits the data, but you're learning an operator which when you solve the corresponding equation produces the dynamics. So it's slightly different. So in this sense, the main technical step of this approach was to obtain an integral equation solver and an integral differential equation solver that was fully differentiable in autograd. So basically you could input a neural network as to model the integral part, and then the model would learn the actual operator or the actual neural network that you need. So this becomes something like this. You have a bunch of data, you initialize your, so this is the solver step, right? You initialize your function, and then you keep modifying your function until convergence. Until here, you see I'm fitting the data. Of course, as always in machine learning, when you do this at the beginning, you're doing this with an integral that is randomly generated. So you will converge to a solution that doesn't even pass close to the data. But that's the thing. Then you learn, you keep training over this data set, and then you will keep learning how to do this better and better until at the end, when you solve this integral equation, or in this case, it's an integral differential equation because it has the derivative here, at the end, you will pass through the data, and therefore this is where your model converges. And this is if you also have space. So for integral equations with respect to space, here you see this is a video with the brain, right? And each frame is your value of the function at time 0, time 1, time 2, and so on and so forth. And here are the spatial coordinates, x1 and x2, or xy, whatever, doesn't really matter. So you pull together from the initialization everything together, you stick it into the integral, you integrate, and you produce a new approximation of your function, and you iterate, you go back with this k equals k plus 1, which is the order of mathematicians, but is a way when you code, this is how you indicate that now you repeat whatever you did at step k, you repeat it at step k plus 1. So you go back and you iterate, and you do this over and over. At the end, you will fit something that you will learn to fit the brain dynamics. So this model will output an integral that passes through the data. So this is substantially an optimization problem. So this is really not fundamental for. I'll just mention for those who do physics and mathematics, they might be interested. In fact, for the integral differential equation, we have we have solved the problem, basically the adjoint equation problem. So the training doesn't happen with automatic differentiation, but you can do it also solving an integral differential equation backward, which was a fundamental thing that they have done for the ordinary differential equations, for instance, in an article called Ordinary Differential Equations. We have done the version for integral differential equations, which becomes, slightly more complicated. The details are found on the paper. These are just the main equations. You can find the adjoint integral differential equations, and solving this thing backward basically tells you how to update your neural network to find convergence to the model. So now more interesting, what about it, right? So what can we do with all this stuff? So let's say now we have a model that learns an integral operator, and let's say we can learn now dynamics. So the first toy experiments are on four-dimensional systems generated by IDEs, and you can see, for instance, that when you have models that like here, this is a projection of the dynamics, right? So when you have a model that takes into account also time, which is the blue one, time integrals, there is the blue one, our model, you can correct over time for the dynamics. So as you see, ordinary differential equation based models, they diverge. So this kind of was one of the toy examples that we had that confirmed our hypothesis that to have these correction terms for brain dynamics, we need integral equations, and we can do that better. So other tests we did on Berger's equation, for instance. So this is this is a 1+1 dimensional system, so space and time. And in this model, a non-differentiable point appears at some point, which is the shock wave. And the model basically is able to go to solve this issue of the shock wave arising. So even if you have dynamics that have sort of unsmoothness, so the brain is not necessarily, excessively smooth. I mean, we don't know that. It's an assumption we make, but it's not necessary. So these models based on integral equations and integral differential equations can take that into account. And of course, this is another interesting model, which is the Navier-Stokes equation. This is, you can see that from noise, you can have this generation of the data from noise, and this is a fluid dynamics model, basically. Also the Berger's equation, but this is the two-dimensional fluid dynamics. So this is closer to the brain. This was the non-brain model that we tested before the brain that was the closest to the brain, actually, because these models the movement of fluid and basically does it with a two-dimensional system, and you see how this system changes over time. So if you think of this as being a frame of the brain, this is pretty much what we want, right? Which brings us to the next point, in fact. How about the brain, right? And one of the main tasks that we were interested into was extrapolating future states from the dynamics. So this was actually done in the most difficult setting, which is you just provide to the data one frame when you start, but the prediction is in fact obtained through training. So this is all data that the model has seen, but this is data that the model has never seen. So it's inventing it from scratch. So it's like you give some artificial intelligence a lot of paintings of Van Gogh, and then you ask, can you produce, a starry night in front of I don't know, something else, right? And the artificial intelligence model will produce an imitation of Starry Night with a person sitting in front of it and on a bench or whatever in the Van Gogh style. This is the equivalent for brain dynamics. So this is something that the model has seen, and this is something that the model is inventing and is thinking what it should have been. And we actually had that data, and we could check, and you see that the extrapolation eventually, this is a model without integral components, and this is a model with integral components. You see that you can predict the future much better if you know the past and you know all the time points in the data set. And this is actually completely unseen, predicted. Everything is unseen to the model. So the model has never seen this data. You just give it the initial condition, and the model says, okay, if a brain is in this initial state, this is what it should evolve. Of course, here, so the mouse that actually they were these are recording of mice performing tasks. So the main thing is that you're saying that when a mouse performs a certain task, there is some underlying truth that you can detect to do predictions. So here is not only a matter of being able to model these dynamics, but eventually the point is that if you can model the dynamics, this operator that you have learned with this method contains information of what the brain is performing. So you can try to relate this to functionality. You can try to do more interesting tasks than just predicting. So here is also an integral equation over fMRI data. This is actually, this is not fMRI data recorded. This is generated through some system on a bunch of nodes. So this is a location of nodes that is depicted here in the vertical coordinate. This is how the intensity varies with respect to time. This is why it doesn't really look like anything close to the brain. But this toy data set actually shows already that even simplified methods can, simplified data sets can create very important issues for models like ResNet, LSTM, Node. These are all famous models that have been tried to model the brain, right? So even simplified data set can create a collapse in the quality of your predictions. And so this is one step further. Now this is closer to what functionality would look like. Why is so? So this video is representing a latent space that you obtain through the integral operator for so you obtain a space with respect to time from the integral operator. What does this mean? It means that this latent space is associated by the operator to the mouse performing a certain task, let's say going on a bike, or sorry, on a wheel. Mice don't usually use bikes. So running on the wheel creates some latent space that can be a sort of fingerprint for dynamics, or at least this is what we would like to obtain, right? So this is on fMRI data set. Another interesting question, other than, I will go back to the latent space, in fact, but because it's very interesting, but there is another point which is interesting, is that integral differential equations have both an integral component and a differential component. So the integral component, which we have called here in a very picturesque way non-Markovian, because it depends on everything, is non-instantaneous, while the differential component is instantaneous. So you can technically take a data set. So this is a very simplified system to see if you can recover the ground truth, the splitting, because the fact that you can model the data doesn't mean that you can recover how the splitting components are superposed to give you the data set, right? So this was an experiment that showed that if you do not over-parameterize your neural network, what you learn actually also gives you the percentage of integral component and the percentage of a differential component that you need. But then you can do this on the brain then, right? So this is fMRI dataset of people. So this is not mice, this is people. And dataset with there is this data set where we had ketamine, people with ketamine and without ketamine. So what you have is this is a projection. So of course this is is everything latent, right? But you can learn how to model this data set, this fMRI data set, and go look at the integral and differential component of those people on ketamine and those without ketamine, right? And you can see that actually the integral component and differential component, they kind of separate with a good degree of accuracy the two conditions. So the percentage to which the differential part and the integral part are superposed to give you this fMRI data is different in the two sets of people, control and ketamine, right? So basically, this is telling you that your model is not only is it modeling, but it's also kind of putting some information aside that you can retrieve by going and look at the right place, the right latent spaces. And also you can see that this model also can reduce the dimensionality of your system in a much more ordered way. So traditional methods like PCA and UMAP, they project, but they have no understanding of time. So you're projecting your brain dynamics in a way that that it doesn't really make sense with respect to time, right? But if you use latent functions learned through integral equations, your projections of the dynamics is well ordered with respect to time. So you have we did some quantitative experiments on this as well, showing that they are it's a good indicator of for the latent spaces. So this is the last slide. So for this Pillola di Ricerca, and I will just mention some more stuff relating to the perspective. So models we're working on, what we want to achieve, and why. So the model, the outputs of the model gives you an integral operator. So, but what this integral operator tells you about the dynamics is what you're really interested into. So dismembering these what you have learned, this model, and going to look for instance, characteristic motifs of the dynamics. For instance, let's say a brain under epilepsy conditions has certain characteristics in this integral operator that you don't see in a brain that doesn't have epilepsy, right? Then you are basically characterizing, you're sort of translating mathematically properties of neurology into an object that is a nonlinear operator in Hilbert spaces, for instance, or Banach spaces. So this to me is quite fascinating. So this is what I'm trying to say here is that you don't want to model for the sake of modeling, but you always have the final goal. And this operator, you can evaluate it as many times as you want, because once it's trained, you have your model, right? So you can run it on whatever type of latent spaces to create whatever latent spaces you want, and you can run unsupervised tasks. For instance, the separation of ketamine and saline conditions that I showed before. There was an unsupervised task because the model did not know that there were two types of dynamics there, one corresponding to saline or ketamine. But even without knowing, something distinguished the two, because there, if the dynamics are different, the integral operator will understand that somehow, because it has to represent different stuff. So it will have different characteristics. The thing is, if you are able to obtain it. So yeah, so to summarize, these models are based on integral differential equations and integral equations, and they are machine learning models that allow you to learn an operator, an integral operator, to be precise. And they are particularly suitable for systems with high degrees of non-locality, such as the brain. And learning these models, so training of these models, basically will give you an object, a mathematical object, that encodes some of the biological properties of the dynamics, and therefore the properties of the brain and conditions. And this is this is all I had to say, and thank you very much. Grazie.